Illinois went without a budget for 2.5 years. And we only got a budget because reasonable Democrats and reasonable Republicans came together, adopted a budget, adopted funding for the 911 systems over the veto of the governor. Regarding school funding reform, the governor has adopted a no-compromise position, which will keep the state in chaos for several weeks and months. We need reasonable people, again, Democrats and Republicans, as we did on the budget and on the 911 funding, to resolve the differences which are leading toward an impasse. The governor should not veto education funding reform because the plan on the governor's desk, soon to be on the governor's desk, is fair to the entire state, fair to every student in the state of Illinois. It's been characterized by some as a Chicago bailout. The truth is that under Senate Bill 1, there are 267 other school districts that get more money per pupil than Chicago does under the bill. And Beth Purvis, education advisor to the governor, has said that the governor feels that he would support 90% of what's in the bill. Yet, we're looking at a threatened veto of Senate Bill 1. Any questions?
Governor Rauner has traveled the state in the last week or so, pointing to specific dollar amounts for districts, and even going so far as calling out specific House Democrats, saying this person doesn't want your district to have extra money. And some of those House Democrats have said they would love to vote for a bill like that to give more money to downstate districts, but that you wouldn't allow a vote for that bill on the floor. Will you commit to allowing a vote on the governor's amendatory veto when it comes?
In all likelihood, the amendatory veto will never get to the House. Are you familiar with the procedures of the amendatory veto?
So you're saying it's going to die in the Senate?
No, I'm asking you a question.
I'm familiar, but when it
Well,
comes,
tell me how familiar you are. What's going to happen in the Senate?
is this a quiz?
Yeah, it's a quiz. The message will come from the governor's office to the Senate. Now, you tell me, what options does Senator Menard have?
How confident are you it's not going to pass the Senate?
You're not answering my question.
You're the one.
You're entitled to be asked questions. That's okay to ask you questions.
So you're obfuscating. You won't answer whether.
No, I'm not obfuscating anything. I'm trying to lead you to an answer that you apparently don't understand.
Okay.
So when the matter comes to the House, in all likelihood, it'll only be on a motion to override. The governor's amendatory veto will never get to the House because it's not going to be considered in the Senate. That's an answer to your question.
So, sir, you're the expert. Does the governor have the authority to do what he says he's going to do in terms of the amendatory veto, boosting funding level? Can he change numbers like that?
Does he have the authority under the Constitution to offer an amendatory veto?
Yes.
The answer is yes, but then there's a determination made by counsel to the Senate President and counsel to the Speaker as to whether he abused his authority under the amendatory veto section of the Constitution.
Based on what he's proposing, would he use his?
Well, we don't know what he's proposing because he hasn't shared any language. Senator Cullerton has asked for the language, and he hasn't gotten the language.
What is the likelihood for an override in the House?
Oh, I think that there's a good possibility of an override in the House.
Have you been having conversations with Republicans?
Well, we've been talking to a variety of people, and there's a real good level of knowledge of what's contained in Senate Bill 1. Senate Bill 1 contains what's characterized as an evidence-based model. That was thoroughly discussed for months during the regular session. Representative Davis in the House, Senator Menard in the Senate, worked with a whole variety of people. So there's a real solid knowledge of the evidence-based model, which is designed to remove a lot of the inequity in the current school aid formula. I think over time, why that level of knowledge will increase, and therefore that will facilitate a sufficient number of votes to override the governor.
Mr. Speaker, I know you've been asked this before, but just yesterday the governor continues to make you an issue, told the editorial board at the Daily Herald that you have a stunning conflict of interest because high property taxes help your business. I'm just wondering, is that helpful, and what What is your response to that, given that he keeps saying things like that?
Here's my response. All of the clients of my law office are public knowledge. Let me repeat that. Every client in my law office is a matter of public knowledge because the filings we do on behalf of clients are filed at the Cook County Assessor and at the Board of Review in Cook County and other assessing offices in the state, in addition to being listed on our law firm website. So there's complete knowledge of what happens in my law office. A little bit ago, a noted journalistic group called the Chicago Tribune reviewed 12 years of filings by my office, 23,000 files. 12 years of filings, 23,000 files, 4 reporters, 11 months. One of the reporters acknowledged to Steve Brown, the reporters never found a file that got special or inappropriate treatment. The reporters never found a client who retained our firm in order to gain influence in the legislature. The reporters never found a client who claimed that I told them that they would gain influence in the legislature if they used my firm. My firm and myself operate under conflict rules. Any potential client seeking a state benefit is rejected. If a client requests my intercession with a state agency, I refuse. If a client expresses an interest in legislation, I recuse myself from consideration of the bill. That's my answer.
Mr. Speaker, even though the bill is currently sitting in the Senate, the governor today basically said that you are the one who has ordered it stalled there.
Yeah.
And he has accused both you and Senator Collins and Democrats, in essence, of creating this crisis, putting lawmakers at the point where you gotta vote for Senate Bill 1 because there's no other way, otherwise kids aren't gonna get their money. Your response.
Yeah, my response is that Senate Bill 1 was thoroughly debated throughout 6 months of session. As I said earlier, there's a very high level of knowledge of the content of Senate Bill 1. The matter will be before the governor very shortly. The governor ought to sign the bill. The governor ought to sign the bill. The governor should not veto education funding reform because the plan contained in Senate Bill 1 is fair to the entire state and to every student in the state of Illinois. As I said earlier, under Senate Bill 1, 267 school districts get more money per pupil than Chicago. And I can quote Beth Purvis again if you wish to listen to my comments on Beth Purvis.
Are you accusing him of creating the crisis with this threatened veto?
We've been working deliberatively and assiduously throughout this session of the General Assembly. I think there's a very clear record that Governor Rauner is not interested in compromise. That was demonstrated in the case of the adoption of the budget. That was demonstrated in the case of the adoption of the funding for the 911 systems. So a budget that we didn't have for 2.5 years, and then the funding for the 911 systems only happened because there was an override of the governor's veto. So that's clear evidence that Mr. Rauner is not interested in compromise.
Mr. Speaker, what advice we have for folks who are looking forward to the first day of school?
Yeah.
Teachers, students, parents, what advice would you have as they watch all this playing
Yeah.
out?
To the best of their ability, they should work with Governor Rauner to the best of their ability and get him to sign Senate Bill 1.
Speaker, why wait the 2 months that it's taken to send it? And we've got checks and balances. If the governor's indicating he's gonna mandatory veto this, why not send it to him June
Yeah.
5th? So we
Well,
can start the process and actually get
yeah.
the funding bill in place.
As you know, the motion to reconsider was filed by Senator Trotter,
Right.
right? So I didn't file the motion. Senator Trotter did.
Speaker Madigan, you opened this by noting that the reasonable Republicans and Democrats who voted
Yeah.
on the budget. Are you convinced that there will still be a working relationship among Democrats and Republicans in the House, given the governor has taken his staff and his office in a different direction?
Well, I would hope that every member of the legislature would work together to solve these problems. These problems are too great to be disregarded because people can't work together. We've demonstrated in the last month that people can't come together. reasonable people can't come together. They did it in adopting the budget and adopting the funding for the 911 systems over the veto of the governor. It happened then, it can happen again.
Speaker, the governor says that you, or the Democrats, I think he points to you, slipped in this funding for the Chicago Public Schools kind of at the last minute, that had not been part of the SB1 negotiations. Would you agree with the governor's statement? And if not, what do you assign the motivations here? Do you think he's just not understanding the facts, or do you think this is just plain politics to try to
No.
gain points against you?
The issues that we're talking about today in Senate Bill 1, which more often than not relate to state funding for the pensions for the Chicago teachers, that was thoroughly discussed in the Senate, thoroughly discussed in the House. The method of achieving that goal was changed in the House. It's just a question of the method of achieving that goal. Today, the state pays the employer's cost of the teachers' pensions for every district outside of Chicago. But the state does not do it for Chicago. And part of Senate Bill 1 would rectify that situation and would provide there would be some state support for the Chicago teachers' retirement system. And let me just give you some statistics, which are pretty helpful to understand this. The total amount of appropriation for, it really helps a lot when you have reading glasses, doesn't it? Yeah, let's do it this way. For the TRS, the downstate system, the appropriation from the legislature will be $4.6 billion. $4.6 billion, which represents a $578 million increase. Chicago doesn't get any of that. And they don't get any help as TRS does from the state. So those are pretty significant numbers. $4.6 billion for every school district outside of Chicago, 0 for Chicago. That's the point that's being addressed in Senate Bill 1. The difference is the method as to how to do it. Certain Republicans are working their way through the Capitol building today, and they have been for about 10 days, saying, we'll agree to put the normal cost for the Chicago teachers, that means money for the Chicago teachers, into the pension code. So they're acknowledging that they're prepared to provide some state support for the pension costs for the Chicago teachers. The only question is the method. How do you achieve the goal?
Mr. Speaker,
should
the
there be-
governor in recent days has said, you told President Cullerton to hold SB1. He also just said upstairs that President Cullerton was on the way to have a press conference with him about pensions, and you called Cullerton and told him not to go. Are either of those true?
That's all the world of Bruce Rauner, right?
That is true or not?
That's all the world of Bruce Rauner. You may want to ask his new staffers about that.
But how do you have confidence that the bill will die in the Senate? How do you have confidence that the bill will not get out of the Senate?
Oh, yeah, Speaker, sorry, you were talking about the pension system in Chicago and how they're responsible for theirs and they don't get any state money,
Yeah.
but this gives them state money. Shouldn't we just change that and take the Chicago teachers' pensions, put it into the TRS? And if so, Governor Rauner has said he wants that to be a completely separate issue from getting school funding to schools by August.
Well, that's been discussed. And if the end result is that there's some state support for the Chicago teachers' pensions, that's a nice laudable goal. But why make it so complicated? You know, why don't you just establish the goal and then move simply to achieve the goal? Why make it so complicated?
But is the goal here to fund schools and classrooms, or is the goal here to fund Chicago teacher pensions?
The goal is to provide reason why the governor should not veto education reform legislation, because it's fair to the entire state, fair to every school district, fair to every student in the state.
Speaker, you
Mr. Speaker,
mentioned.
what do you think of the governor's new staff? How will that impact your working relationship with them?
Thank you.
I don't know any of those people. Maybe you do.
Well, they've made no secret of their feelings about you. What does that mean in terms of compromise and moving
Well,
forward?
you know, I work not to get personal about these things. I recognize that that happens, but I think it's more important that people be reasonable. Identify the problems that are afflicting the people of the state of Illinois and are brought here to the legislature. Be reasonable and work to solve the problems, as we did on the budget making and on the funding for the 911 systems.
Do you think they're reasonable?
I'm not going to get into that. And I'm going to wish all of you a wonderful day. Enjoy yourselves. Which will keep the state in chaos for several weeks and months. We need reasonable people, again, Democrats and Republicans, as we did on the budget and on the 911 funding, to resolve the differences which are leading toward an impasse. The governor should not veto education funding reform because the plan on the governor's desk, Illinois went without a budget for 2.5 years. And we only got a budget because reasonable Democrats and reasonable Republicans came together, adopted a budget, adopted funding for the 911 systems over the veto of the governor. Regarding school funding reform, the governor has adopted a no-compromise position.
Some of those House Democrats have said they would love to vote for a bill like that to give more money to downstate districts, but that you wouldn't allow a vote for that bill on the floor. Will you commit to allowing a vote on the governor's amendatory veto when it comes?
In all likelihood, the amendatory veto will never get to the House. Are you familiar with the procedures of the amendatory veto?
So you're saying it's going to die in the Senate?
No, I'm asking you a question. The governor feels that he would support 90% of what's in the bill, yet we're looking at a threatened veto of Senate Bill 1. Any questions?
Yeah, Governor Rauner has traveled the state in the last week or so, pointing to specific dollar amounts for districts, and even going so far as calling out specific House Democrats, saying this person doesn't want your district to have extra money. And
Soon to be on the governor's desk is fair to the entire state, fair to every student in the state of Illinois. It's been characterized by some as a Chicago bailout. The truth is that under Senate Bill 1, there are 267 other school districts that get more money per pupil than Chicago does under the bill. And Beth Purvis, education advisor to the governor, has said that